Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many events we're looking forward to is Jonathan Evison in conversation with Thomas Konstam about Evison's new novel, Legends of the North Cascades, this Thursday, the 10th. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media. Tonight, we are absolutely thrilled to welcome Trystan Reese and Andrew Solomon. Trystan Reese launched into public eye as the pregnant man in 2017 when the story of his family's unique journey gained international media attention. He was invited to give closing performances for the Moth main stage in Portland, Albuquerque, and Brooklyn, and a video of the Brooklyn event was garnered over 2.5 million views. As interest in his family's story grew, Trystan partnered with many major media outlets, including CNN, NBC, People, and BuzzFeed. Trystan is an established thought leader, educator, and speaker focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the founder of his own consulting firm, Collaborate Consulting, where Trystan provides customized training for solutions for individuals, organizations, and communities interested in social justice. When Trystan was just a year into his relationship with Biff, the couple learned that Biff's niece and nephew were about to be removed from their home by Child Protective Services. Immediately, Trystan and Biff took in 1-year-old Hailey and 3-year-old Lucas, becoming caregivers overnight to 2 tiny survivors of abuse and neglect. From this surprising start, Trystan and Biff built a loving marriage and happy home, learning to parent on the job. They adopted Hailey and Lucas and soon decided to grow their family biologically with a child that Tristan, who is transgender, would carry. Tristan's groundbreaking pregnancy attracted media fanfare, and the family welcomed baby Leo in 2017. In his book, How Do We Family? From Adoption to Trans Pregnancy, what we learned about love and the LGBTQ parenthood, Trystan shares their unique story and what he's learned about being the best parent, partner, and person you can be. Joining Trystan in conversation this evening is Andrew Solomon. He is a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University Medical Center and past president of Penn American Center, and a writer and lecturer on psychology, politics, and the arts, and an activist in LGBTQ rights, mental health, and the arts. His 2012 book, Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, won the National Book Critics Circles Award for nonfiction and was chosen as one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2012. Far and Away, How Travel Can Change the World was published in 2016 and was named a New York Times notable book. He previously wrote Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression, which won the 2001 National Book Award and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Most recently, he made an award-winning film of Far from the Tree, available on Hulu. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well as if someone has typed a question that you'd like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Trystan and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. A link to buy How Do We Family, along with Andrew's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. The release date of Trystan's book was moved to June 29th, so the order you place tonight will be shipped at the end of the month. Trystan, Andrew, we're so thrilled to have you both here joining us tonight, and thanks for being here.
Well, what a pleasure and an honor to be here. Trystan and I have known each other for many years and have been friends, and I followed your journey, Trystan, with great engagement and interest. And I would just like to say, even if you think you know what Trystan's journey entailed and think you understand what the story really is, you have to buy and read this book because it's so moving, it's so funny, it's so warm, and it's so profound about what family is and about what love is and about how, against all odds, you can manage to find the glories of intimacy in places where they weren't necessarily wholly to be assumed. And so it's a wonderful read. You'll cancel everything else and spend the afternoon with it, and you'll know a million things you didn't know before. So Trystan, great to be here with you.
Oh my goodness, it's so scary and exciting to be right on the precipice of releasing my 4th baby into the world. I'm not sure how you've done it as many times as you have. It's more terrifying than I would have expected.
It is terrifying, and you will have noticed I wrote a book about depression, so that perhaps is the answer to your question. Tristan, I think you said you were going to read a little passage, and why don't we do that? I think it would be great for people to know your authorial voice before we get going with the rest of the questions.
Okay, I didn't know I was going to do that very first, but I'm ready. Well, my copy came from the publisher today, so here it is in my hand. I've been in denial about it, but now I can no longer be in denial for it. It is real, it is here. So I'm going to tell I believe a heretofore unknown story in terms of me doing podcasts or whatever. And it takes us to the summer of 2012, about a quarter of the way in. It was the summer of 2012, and Our Lady J had a concert at Casita del Campo, a Mexican restaurant and performance venue in Silver Lake on the east side of LA proper. I had emailed, called, and texted all our friends to let them know about the proposal. At my request, Biff's parents even came down so Kimberly could be there when it happened. Mark agreed to watch Hailey and Lucas for the evening. In my pocket, I could feel the heavy weight of the titanium ring I had custom made for the occasion. The jeweler agreed to let me purchase it on a payment plan, and I'd been sending checks every month for half a year. We parked the car and held hands as we walked into the venue. As we sat down, Biff noticed how many of our friends were in the audience with us. Dang, I guess everyone we know loves Our Lady J, he exclaimed. Is that Samir? I didn't know he was into her. Yep, guess so, I agreed, trying to sound casual. TT and Benji was there, so was my boss, who had watched our relationship blossom from the very beginning, as were half a dozen of Biff's friends from the social group he ran. The lights went down and the show started. Our Lady J emerged into the spotlight on the tiny stage and began her usual shtick, funny, touching stories about her life and childhood, along with Dolly Parton covers and original songs with sweeping piano refrains. Her feet pounded the pedals as I began to sweat. Then she said the phrase I had been waiting for. Ah, love. I love love. Do we have any lovers in the audience? Is anyone here in love? A smattering of hands went up. She shaded her eyes to look out at the crowd, pretending to notice me for the first time. Is that Tristan out there? Are you two in love? Come on up here, you guys. This was it. Exactly as planned. I grabbed Biff's hand and we made our way down the aisle and up onto the stage. Jay handed me the microphone and I took a deep breath. A confused hush fell over the audience as our friends awaited the question and strangers tried to figure out what was happening. Biff, as you know, I love you very much, and I never want to be without you. I've loved getting to know you and having so many adventures with you, and I promise you, if you say yes, I fumbled around in my pocket and pulled out the ring. I will give you a whole lifetime of adventures. Shaking and sweating, I awkwardly got down on one knee and held the ring up. A collective gasp shook the room as everyone suddenly understood what was happening. Will you marry me? Biff's face registered complete shock as he took the ring and stared blankly at it. The spotlight made it hard to see him fully, and I was still holding the microphone in my hand, but I knew he hadn't answered either way yet. Time slowed to a crawl. What if he says no? In front of all these people, what was I thinking? Why couldn't I just let a good thing be? Why did I have to complicate everything? I finally shrugged my shoulders, trying to say silently to him, well, is that a yes? He shook his head slightly as if to wake himself out of a trance and exclaimed, yes, of course, yes, of course. I stood up to kiss him as the audience exploded into cheers. Jay began to play her next song and I returned the mic to its stand. Biff pulled me back to our seats, his face glowing in a way I had not seen before, and he kept looking at the ring I'd given him as if he could not believe it was real. We settled back in our seats, my stomach humming with excitement. Did you really not know? Was it a real surprise? I asked him quietly. I had no idea. Is that why our friends are all here? He whispered as Jay wailed away in the background. Yes, I told him. Your mom too. I've been working on it for months. He smiled and squeezed my hand. I love you, he said. I love you, I replied. And then we began to plan our wedding.
Oh, it's a great scene to read and it's a great scene to hear. And I want to share with the audience that Tristan has just told me he's recording the audiobook. So if you love the sound of Tristan's words and Tristan's voice, that's a pleasure that lies ahead for you. A pleasure too. I'm sort of torn between wanting to ask the totally obvious questions that I imagine you've been asked a million times, because I don't know how many of the people in the audience really know you and know your whole story, and wanting to ask, sort of stranger and subtler and more remote questions. But I guess I would start with the kind of basic question of, did you, when you understood that you were trans, think that you would have a family in one way or another?
Never.
How did you come to the point at which you felt like, yes, I'm ready to be a dad?
Oh, I'm still not there. So let's just put that somewhere else. No, I mean, even, and my mom can attest, because I think she's watching this, I even as a kid, I never wanted to be a parent. I mean, I never wanted to grow up. The book of Peter Pan, the story of Peter Pan was always, to me, analogous of the perfect life, to be with the Lost Boys and live in Never Never Land and not have responsibilities. Sounded great to me. And then as my queerness unfolded and presented itself to me, that was right in alignment with that approach. The idea that, in fact, well, we couldn't have those things, many of us anyway, which is great because we didn't want them. And so it was, it all sort of became reinforced over time. And it just never occur to me that I could be a parent. I did love kids, and eventually I hit a point where I said, well, I guess I'd like to settle down with somebody or some people at some point. But really, I never did. And when I was told by my doctor, when I first started transitioning, that testosterone would likely make me sterile, I just signed on the dotted line. I truly did not give it any thought. And I certainly didn't know that he was incorrect. And even if he had been correct, I would have gladly signed it away to be able to transition. And really, it wasn't until I met Biff that it started to occur to me that, in fact, this door that I thought had been closed was unlocked, and I could just open it and walk right through. Yeah, so it wasn't until much later that I thought about that.
And tell me about how the two experiences differed. Your first two children came to you very suddenly and without your having much time to plan, and it involved a great deal of uncertainty and paperwork and everything in order to make them fully, legally at least, part of your family, and a lot of work, I think, even to make them emotionally fully part of your family, because it was also sudden. Not that the love wasn't there, but just that it was a process which was very different from the process with Leo, which is the one that I think has gotten more of the media attention, because he's the one you actually carried as a pregnant person. But tell me about how you felt in those two different situations and how they contrasted to each other.
Well, I hate to say this, and anybody who's given birth to a child is going to really resent me for saying this, but it was so much easier to carry and give birth to and then care for a newborn than it was to go from 0 to 2 children overnight as a 20-something, completely unprepared. And that's really the biggest difference, is it was just easier. Because it was more straightforward, which, again, I know sounds completely counterintuitive to be a man who had a baby and that be the straightforward way, but it really was. As was, I think, not the depth or passion of love that I have for them, but just the journeys of getting there. It's different to really form love over a longer period of time. And because things are hard, that kind of brought me closer, I think, to Lucas and Hailey than it would have otherwise if it had been part of some longer planned out situation. And it really caught me by surprise. I can remember the first time I was walking down the sidewalk in Hollywood with Lucas, who was 3, and a car comes up, and it's a really loud car. And without even thinking about it, I just sort of snatched him up in my arms. Those little moments for me were the times when it's like, oh, I'd throw myself in front of a bus for this kid. I would do anything for him. Like, there are parts of my, ancestral brain now that are at work that just, or when we lived in New York City, and one time we're in the subway, the doors open up and he just steps right off the subway. And without even realizing he's done it, before I can even say anything, my hand just goes out, grabs his hoodie and pulls him back in, and the doors close. I these are the tribal parts of our brain. They're not any part of our conscious thinking. And so it was in those moments that it was like, oh, I'm a parent, and I love him with a deep passion and almost a fury that is scary sometimes. As opposed to Leo, who showed up in the world all innocence and purity, and it was easy. It was just much easier than this other situation. Again, the depth is not different, but just sort of the pathway, I guess, there was.
And tell me about your decision to be open and public about your pregnancy and about the structure of your family. It earned you a lot of love. It seems to have also have earned you a lot of hate that I think you had to struggle with and deal with. I think you must have known ahead of time that you would get some of each. You may not have known how much or how it would feel. But tell me about that decision, which is, in a way, I think in its great efflorescence in this book, in which you finally speak entirely in your own voice without being mediated by the sources that are reporting on your story.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, the conversation happened in this exact room. You know, sometimes those pivotal moments in your life, you can like, I was even thinking, Andrew, you're talking about, you giving me advice on reading my own audiobook. Like, I can literally remember the airplane and the seat I was sitting in when I listened to Far From the Tree on a long flight with, you were there for that. You know, you were in my life, though you didn't know it at the time. I don't know that we had even met. And so, you know, it's like those places, and this room, like I literally came up the stairs having watched on, you know, Facebook or YouTube somewhere, an interview with, you know, with Janet Mock or Laverne Cox or some other really incredible, brilliant, bold, brave Black trans woman being unknowingly, unconsciously eviscerated by some well-meaning journalist, and being so patient and kind and loving and gracious, you know, just sharing, well, I'm going to just point out to you why that question is, you know, isn't the best question to ask, you know, giving them, I think, far more grace than, everyone deserves grace, of course, but, you know, more than I would think that they deserved as an outside observer who's also transgender. And I just had a light bulb go off in my head, and Biff was up here and I was downstairs, and I walked up the stairs. I said, I think we have to tell our story. And Biff was like, what do you know, why would we ever do that? Look what happens. Look what happens if people do that, you know? And I just explained, I watched this interview, and I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair for myself as a white, binary, trans person living in Portland, Oregon, who has every privilege that anyone could ever hope for as a trans person. I think there's one famous Hollywood couple that has a trans kid. Okay, maybe that trans person has more privilege than me, but other than that, I'm surrounded by layers of safety, visible and invisible. And I just said, I don't think it's right to put all of that work on them. And it was done intentionally for many years. And you know this, Andrew, because you come from the movement, the LGBTQ movement. It was intentional. You know, transgender men agreed verbally out loud at conferences, convenings, convention. We agreed, if we get handed a microphone, you hand it off to a trans woman. If you can find a Black trans woman, you hand it to her. Like, we did that. And then it just kind of felt like at this point, we may have overcorrected and put too much responsibility on them. And now that there is more of a conversation, maybe there's a chance to take some of the weight off of them and to tell a different kind of story. And my least favorite question is when people say, well, was it worth it? Because how could you ever possibly know? You know, was it worth it to have told your story? And that's still a question that I'm not sure that I have the answer. I may never have the answer to. I lost things that I don't think I will ever get back as a result of telling my story. And that was not something that I anticipated.
I think you will actually have the answer to that question. I mean, my situation was, you know, somewhat less radical than yours. I put the story of my family out into the world for many of the same reasons, and with the sense that I had, you know, obligations came with privilege, and if I wouldn't tell this story, then who would? And I've ended up with so many people who've said, reading your work helped me decide to have a family. And I think when you think that there are these relationships, people who then found great joy in being parents, And boy, your book is so courageous and so straightforward and so generous in its outlook. And I think that it will give people an ability, a wish, an understanding of, a capacity to be parents who wouldn't otherwise have had all of that. And I think it'll change people's lives. And I think the publicity you did around what happened, even though I know some of it was very traumatic, ultimately is going to serve that function. So that's what I think, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think it's just that back and forth that I feel around, like, even if it was a gift that has served the world, what cost did it come at for me and for what I have left and for what I thought were the best parts of myself? And Biff says, I love you now way more than I ever did before. You know, you with a more realistic, more nuanced, mature view of who people truly are is preferable. And I'm like, of course, you, the cynic, would say that. I miss the old me who thought that people were inherently good. And if you just told your story with enough love, compassion, intentionality, then people will be like, you're right, this is awesome. I mean, I miss that version of me. I liked that version of me.
I interviewed someone some years ago who was an activist who had become an activist for various complex reasons, but who said to me, I actually preferred being frivolous. And I always thought that was a sort of take to, not that you were frivolous, but that there is that that element of innocence that is definitely something that's given up. Tell the story, since we're talking about this and about the sort of the bad PR and the good stuff. Tell me the story, or tell our viewers the story of Hailey and of the experience when she asked you whether anyone had had mean things to say to you. It's what you end the book with, but it's so exquisite and I think worth repeating.
Yeah, I think that was probably the part of the book that came back with no edits. At that point, it was just like, nope. I mean, that was one of those things where in the moment as it was happening, I was like, there it is. There's the button, I guess. Yeah, I mean, pre-COVID, I was traveling so much for work, and I felt bad both about saddling with Biff with 3 kids while I was gone. And I also, really regretted that I was missing sort of chunks of their childhood. And so I started to arrange it such that I could bring one child with me on each trip that I went on. And so I got to have that one-on-one time. They got to spend time in whatever city I was in. I tacked a couple of extra days onto the work trip, and that's it. I'm in LA with Hailey, or I'm in San Francisco with Lucas, or Chicago, or, any of those places. And so I took Hailey down to LA with me, and we got stuck in traffic, as is wont to happen when you live in LA. And we were just sort of in the rental car with that new rental car smell. And I don't even know what made her think of it. She just turned to me and asked, did people say mean things about you when you told our story? Like when we were in the news and stuff, did people say mean things about you? And, I try really hard to be both honest with the kids, but also mindful of what is appropriate for them to carry. And my mom will often correct me when I have gone too far in the honesty realm, and will say, I think that's a little bit much to ask them to take on. And I'm usually, of course, defensive in the moment, but afterwards I'm like, yes, you're right. You're right. And so at the time I decided, yes, I'll be honest. I knew she was going to ask what they'd said. And so I said, yes, they did say mean things about me. And she said, well, tell me what they were. And I said, no, I'm not going to tell you. You're too little. It's not appropriate for you to hear some of the worst things that people would say. But even though I didn't tell her what those things were, she just started crying, because like me, her emotions are this close to the surface all the time. It doesn't take much for them to just bubble over. And so she starts crying and asks if I ever cried. And I said, yes. And we, that kind of cracked open some kind of a liminal space between us, where I knew I could ask whatever I wanted and I would get the whole perfect, pure truth. And I asked her, I said, do you ever wish that we were different, that you were in a different family that was more like other families? And, she didn't even have to think about it. And she said, no, never in a million billion years would I want to be in any kind of family other than what we have. And that's how we close out the book, is my little magical moment stuck in the smoggy traffic of LA.
You never know when the magic is going to come.
You really don't. I heard some male feminist many years ago, like maybe 20 years ago, give a speech at some university or something, and he said, you know, a lot of people talk about quality time, but there's something to be said for quantity time. And that's why I like to travel with the kids, because it is in those spaces. You don't have to be doing something that somebody else would deem as important. You could just be sitting in traffic and commit to being in the moment. And so, yeah.
For me, with my kids, I feel like quantity time was the great gift of the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic was very hard on kids for a lot of reasons. And my kids at 12 and 13 each faced challenges in this regard. But boy, the time that we spent together was so transformative for me. And I think transformative for them in ways that are maybe not entirely legible to them yet, but will be in time. There was something that struck me a lot as I was reading the book, which is that in my experience of you, I've seldom seen you when you weren't smiling, and you always have a kind of happy-go-lucky and sort of air of fun about you. And the first time we met, I think actually was, I think it was before Far from the Tree, but it was at a task force party in LA. And I remember talking to you on some terrace or something. I think it was either shortly before or shortly after Lucas and Hailey came into your household. So I don't remember what year that would make it. But anyway, but you've had that sort of approach. And yet in the book, you describe all of these moments of hesitancy and anxiety, your sort of uncertainty about whether Biff could ever possibly be interested in you or would even return your calls, your uncertainty about whether what you should do by way of proposal, and how he had suggested to people using a hot air balloon to propose and all of those other things, and you're feeling that you had to build this whole thing up, and you're worried about whether you were doing it the right way. And then especially the scene, which I think is one of the most poignant in the book, when you're out at a camp or something, I can't quite remember, but you are getting ready to say, what would you think of having a baby? And you begin by suggesting, what if we repurposed our guest room, is sort of the gist of it. And tell me about those moments of uncertainty, and tell me about the ways in which you think that they represent anything that is endemic to queer life, or whether you think they're the same for everyone in all kinds of ways.
Well, as usual, you have posed a very complicated question. And I remember that terrace in LA, and that's one of the things I miss about being in the nonprofit movement, is getting to see some of the truly beautiful ways that queer people in particular are able to fashion their homes and their lives. Mark Sexton is on this call, and I've been on a similar terrace of Mark's out looking out over downtown Portland. I do miss those moments. And, you know, I think a lot of people, I think often a misconception about me is that I'm sort of like always happy. And the thing that comes to mind is one of the best things for me about having kids is getting to introduce them to the world. And, you know, especially Leo, who's almost 4, he just asks why about everything, you know, so he wants to know, why do flowers have thorns? Why does that one weed stick to you when you walk by it, you know? And so I talk to him often about how different things evolve to survive. And some things are pretty, and that's how they survive. People like them. They want to have them around. Other things have thorns to keep people away, to protect them. It's just all different ways of surviving. And I'm not sure how or when or why, or if it was natural or any of that. It's just kind of like how I've made it through the world is to be someone that is a light. You know, it's gotten me out of a lot of tough situations. It's gotten me into a lot of good situations. And so I think that's just how I've found for people to navigate it, which is, you know, I think not unlike the sort of some of the best of the gay tropes, that we are like your best friend from theater. Like that's how we stayed alive. We made people like us. They felt bad for us then when something bad happened. They wanted to come to our aid. When we told them that they should do something differently, they wanted to follow. And I think that's sort of where I fit in the gay multiverse, the queer multiverse. And I don't know if other people have the same levels of doubt or discomfort or anxiety or fear. And probably it's two sides of the same coin, right? If I have staked so much on people liking me, then the fear is that what if they don't? And what if this has all just been a grand performance or something? And there are still moments. I mean, Biff and I have been together for 11 years, and there's still moments. Last week there's a person in Biff's life that he's spending a lot of time with right now for work things, and I had to say, I just need a little bit of reassurance that there's not a little spark there. This is a very attractive person. I think that they're more attractive than me. They're certainly younger than me. They've never had a baby, and so even now, after all this time, now I think I'm better at just saying, I'm feeling insecure. I need a little reassurance, instead of doing any kind of weird passive aggressive things. But yeah.
It's striking in the book that you don't talk about your own transition. You don't talk about that whole earlier chapter of your life in either the present tense or really in any significant way in the past tense and how you came to be who you are. But it would be interesting to hear you talk about the way that sort of, I don't know, the words all seem so loaded, but that decision to change gender, and then that decision in effect to do something that is mostly associated with the gender with which you no longer identified, at least primarily. How did that all balance out, and how did you get it to balance out, and how much did all of what you went through summon in your mind difficulties that you had experienced in transitioning? Maybe there weren't any, but I doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, it's my editor is here with us, Bacha, and that's how it got all balanced out. I wrote those chapters, Andrew. I really did. I wrote the coming out story, the realizing for myself, finding place in community, but only not. But then, and coming out to my parents, like that's like in a file somewhere. And I'm really, really lucky because I just had a really, Bacha at the experiment just helped me so much figure out what is the story. This doesn't have to be all the stories, right? What is the story? And there are other places for those other stories, like I have like a dream of an actual, like a memoir, and I'm like, great, that can be book 2, fine. But to have that narrow focus that is less teaching and less past and more this, was really the focus that she brought, that I feel is such a gift. And of course, it's hard in the beginning to have someone be like, cutting that, cutting that, cutting that, cutting that. But looking at it now, I'm like, oh, this is fine. This is good. It was nice to just focus on a couple of hard things and less the thing that you can get anywhere, right? Anyone can tell you a hard coming out story, whether it's a 13-year-old or someone older or someone trans, or those exist. This doesn't exist as much. So that's how that happened. And I like that it's not there. That's what you expect,
And when you were pregnant with Leo, you talk in the book about the issues that came up because of the publicity you'd done. But did you, in your own life, encounter people, either trans or other queer people, who felt betrayed by your decision to be pregnant, or people on the street who gave you strange looks, or how did any of it sort of go down?
I know the joke I often say is I expect women to be mad at me because I'm the one who stormed out of the lady party 20 years ago, slammed the door in their faces and swore I'd never be back, right? I get it. Now I'm sort of inching my way back in. That I totally get. And for me, truly the biggest fear that I had going into telling our story publicly, I was worried about the backlash from within the trans community, because I expect other people to do what other people do. I expect Reddit to do what Reddit's going to do, But for me, me telling my story was my own way of giving a gift to my community, both past, present, and future. That was the goal of it. They're not the audience for the book because my story isn't that exciting to most trans people. They're like, yeah, okay, get it. Man has a baby. Been happening for 20 years. Who cares? The book is for other people, but the present, the reason I did it is in service of the community. And so to worry, which I did, that people were going to say, look, you're making it harder for people to accept us. We just got them to see us as men. Now you're going in there messing everything up. That was my worst fear. And I think maybe I saw that once in a comment thread before I stopped reading comments, but every other time, I mean, we were at Trans Pride and I was 8.5 months pregnant. I missed the labor and delivery class because I chose to go to Trans Pride instead of going to learn about stupid labor. And like, there were like old trans dudes that came up to me and they're like, this is awesome. Like, I could never do that, but it is so cool that you're doing that. And all, like, nearly universally, that was the response, was just like, thank you for showing people that there isn't one way to do this, and for continuing to broaden the what's possible. You know, in the trans community, we say possibility models, you know, and not role models, for being another possibility model. It's not a competition to see who can do trans right. It's a competition to see how many different cool ways we can do it. And that was the thing for me that I was like, oh, okay, good, this is great. It made it easier to weather some of the other harder pieces. But in person, virtually nothing, almost completely go into the coffee shop and the staff is like, oh, we saw your story, like your breakfast is on us, like much more that kind. It's Portland. It's a stereotype, but it's also true. You know, I'm connected to hundreds of trans people all over the world going through these kinds of processes. They do not have the same experience in other places. I know this is kind of part of the Portland bubble. Yeah, or even like, you know, our kids going to school. When our story went public, one of the neighbors, like when people in their neighborhood like sent a baby gift home with their kid to give to our son, to give to us, and they wrote a card that said, thank you for telling your story publicly. It gave me a great reason to start to talk to my kids about all the different ways families can show up in the world. You know, so that's really what we got in person, which I am very grateful for, because it could have gone a different way.
Well, I was talking to my own kids today about the experience. And I have a trans godchild, and I feel like that openness that you're describing is so attractive. That was shocking and I think dismaying when Renee Richards a few years ago said, God intended people to be men or women. He didn't intend people to be in this in-between place. And I thought, okay, the idea that God actually thinks it's okay to be trans the way you're trans, but not okay to be trans or queer in these other ways, suggests a rather closer dialogue with God on your part than I'm willing to subscribe to. So there's a lot of that, though. This is the way to be trans. This is the way to be gay. This is the way to be queer. This is the way to look. This is the way to do things. Did you always see yourself as someone who would be able to buck that idea of what was possible, or not what was possible, who would be able to buck that idea of how other people wanted to define you within your transness, queerness, or anything else?
No, not at all. It was a process for me the same way it is for most people. You know, it's like an actual psychological process, you know, and there were many years when I wanted nothing more than to not be trans. And when I was working out every single day, if you can believe that, and drinking protein shakes and paying a personal trainer, and, you know, all trying as much as possible to appear like any other man who just didn't happen to be trans. And it really wasn't until, I don't think wasn't until I found Biff that I found a new sense of, yes, I'm different, and that's not just okay, it's actually great. You know, again, that's another sort of joke I make, is like, you know, RuPaul says you can't, how can you love somebody else until you love yourself? And I'm like, you know, for me, it was totally the opposite. I couldn't love myself until someone else loved me. It wasn't until I saw the way that Biff saw me, myself reflected in him, that I was like, oh, well, he's great. And if he thinks I'm worthy of love, like maybe he's onto something, you know? And so I don't think I got that level of confidence until then.
And tell just for a moment, because we've been being conceptual rather than anecdotal, but tell just for a moment about the party where you met Biff and about the way that it all began.
This is our 10-year-old's favorite story. Like once a week, she'll be like, remember when? Yes. So the fateful brunch, we have these two lovely queer/trans friends who live in LA. I met them through the No on Proposition 8 campaign, actually. One of them was an attorney and was just like hardcore volunteer. And so we were all spending a lot of time with each other. And so we became friends. And so they just had a community brunch at their house. And I went, and as it was actually 2 blocks from my house in Hollywood. And so I was sort of walking there, still wearing my clothes from having bartended the night before, because I had not gone to bed until maybe 3 or 4 a.m. And I woke up, brushed my teeth, ate a snack, and then headed to the brunch. And I saw Biff crossing the street, clearly going to the same thing that I was, and was just completely smitten right away. He was just, for me, it's like you put on like that shirt that just feels really comfy, that like feeling of like home and comfort. Like that's just what I felt when I saw him. And I said, "Oh, are you going to CT and Benji's thing?" And he was like, "Yeah, I'm going." And I was like, "Great, we can walk together." So we walked in, did a whole brunch where I was trying to flirt, just like give everything that I had, really in that, with the hubris of a 26-year-old, just completely shameless. And he was not in any way, shape, or form interested. Like there was nothing to indicate that there was interest at all. And then I went to the restroom and washed my hands. And then when I looked in the mirror, I realized that I had the salad that I'd had as a snack had lodged itself right in one of my front teeth, and my entire front tooth was covered with spinach. And I later found out that Biff, in fact, thought that I had a dead tooth, like a whole black tooth in the front. So, and I left in shame and called my best friend on the way home. And I said, I met the man of my dreams, and I had something in my teeth when I did it. And she was like, "You're gonna, like, there is no coming back from this. You have to let this go. Like, you cannot dwell on this. The bridge is burned. Find someone new." And I did not listen to her, thank goodness. But yes, that's the meet cute that they never show you in romantic comedies. Just totally humiliated. It's horrible.
And yet here we are, however many years later it is, and it all turned out just fine.
Listen, it was a lot of work to come back from that.
I'm going to keep asking you questions, but I wanted to say to the folks at home that we are really happy to take your questions. You can put them in the Q&A tab, which is on the bottom of your screen. At least on mine, it's sort of one tab from the right. We'd love to hear from you if there are things that you would like to ask Trystan about his life, love, book, experience, identity, or anything else.
Or questions you'd like to ask Andrew, and I will ask them. And I mean, that's my question for you, is how have you survived? Flippant comments about your depression book aside, how have you built up your resilience against the inevitable onslaught that happens anytime one of your TED Talks hits over 1 million viewers, or whatever it happens to be? What's your castle, your moat?
Well, thank you for asking that.
It's selfish, I need to know.
I feel like it wasn't, not to sound like a copycatter, but I feel like it wasn't until I met John that I was ready to be an activist. I remember I met John when I was in my mid-30s, 20 years ago next month. And I remember about 3 or 4 years before that, they were organizing a sort of celebration of gayness at my high school. And of course, my high school was very loaded, and I'd been terribly closeted there, or at least trying to be terribly closeted there, et cetera, et cetera. And I just thought, I don't have a feeling of sort of this being joyful and wonderful. I have a feeling of this being something I'm coping with. And I thought, I'm not going to get up in front of a bunch of high school students and say, well, if you're gay, then in 15 years, you'll find that you can cope with it. That didn't seem like such a message of hope, and I didn't think I belonged on that stage. And then within a few years of my meeting John, and without my drawing the connection initially, I found myself joining the board of the task force and getting involved in activism. I had already actually written a novel that was partly about being gay, and so I'd already covered some of the questions that came up. But the confidence that I have, which is, of course, inconsistent, but the confidence I have and the resilience that I have, I think really came with the stability of that relationship. And I don't at all, in saying that, want to suggest that that's the way to get there. I think there are plenty of people who have great confidence before they get into relationships, and plenty of people who don't want to be in relationships and have great confidence and meaning in other kinds of life. But for me, I think, and it was also for me the revelation that we could have a family, because I had spent years thinking if you were queer, that meant you couldn't have a family. And I really wanted to be true to myself, and I really wanted to have kids. And I really felt like it was an impossible choice that I was faced with. So yeah, I would say that was sort of the nexus of resilience, and resilience has always been my subject. I mean, my first group was about Soviet artists, and it was about how they were resilient living in a regime in which they were being sent to prison camps. And my next book dealt in part with my mother's illness and death, and how she managed to achieve great dignity in that whole the experience of having cancer. And so I just feel like I circle back to it. People say to me, "You've written about such different subjects." I do circle back to that over and over. But tell me, for you, so when when you were pregnant with Leo, did you worry at any point that your relationship to him would upstage your relationships to Luke and Hailey?
I mean, they were certainly worried about that, but I wasn't. I mean, I couldn't ever imagine anything happening that could get in the way of this powerful connection that I feel to both of them. I just couldn't imagine. I hoped that another parking spot in my heart would open up, and it did. And whenever you think you've gotten to the depths of the love that you're capable of, the floor drops out and there's another floor below that. And so I think that what they were worried about was that, they had to crawl, they all had to squish into one, limited space. But, of course, that's just not how love is. It just grows. And so I wasn't worried about that, but they were. What I was worried about was that Biff would not feel the same connection to Leo that I had, because I'd had that experience of actually growing him in my body. And so there were lots of things we did to help with that, that I did to help with that, because Biff was not worried about that. So yeah, I wasn't worried.
Right. Well, we have our first question from the audience out there. Someone who wants to know, how did the medical community treat you when pregnant?
Yeah. I mean, the medical community is like, that's very broad. And so what I can say specifically, the providers that I worked with, it was a real mix of, they were already pretty ready, which doesn't happen by magic. Someone must have done a lot of work at Kaiser of Oregon and Southwest Washington to get them ready to receive someone like me. And so I think they were pretty ready already. And then from my own years of advocacy, it was very like second nature for me to advocate for myself, to call ahead and say, I'm transgender. I want to work with a certified nurse midwife who is accomplished and has worked with a lot of transgender people before and is excited to work with me, and take all the time you need to figure out who that person is. And then come back when you know who it is. And, that kind of approach I just took over and over and over and over and over. If something happened that I didn't like, I said, hey, here's what happened. I didn't like it. Here's why I didn't like it. Here's what I expect from you moving forward. Can you do that? If you can't do that, can you find me someone who can? And using the Canadian politeness / passive aggressive, that's sort of how I did both. So it's both really strongly saying, here's what I expect from you. I know you can do it. And, someone's putting in the chat, shout out to Aaron at Kaiser, getting them ready. I'm sure there were multiple people at Kaiser, but I found everyone I could possibly find who did work at Kaiser to be like, if this was you, thank you, because it doesn't happen by accident. And then I would say even more broadly, largely speaking, I mean, now, like, I've spoken at the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, as well as being on their podcast. I'm doing some work with ACOG, the American something C of obstetrics and gynecology. So, I'm doing quite a bit of work with the medical community, because they just care about the data and the science, and the data and the science is very clear. It's perfectly healthy for trans people to give birth. That's, They want to know, how do we show up and support them? So yeah, surprisingly, I think things were okay for me.
One of the things that's striking in the book that connects to that is that I think you've done a lot of community building. It was a lot of the work that you did in the nonprofit sector. It was something that you powerfully did in putting together the world of friends whom you describe, who all sound like amazing people, the ones who were there that day when you got up on the stage and proposed. And I felt reading it, when you described your medical providers, even though you didn't go into huge detail about finding them, I thought it took a lot of focus and energy and determination and skill to find all of those people who were pretty unconditionally on your side through all of this. Not only on your side, but on your side and unintimidated by it, who didn't feel like, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, I don't know. You were able to give them the sense of sort of, here are the issues that are the same issues you've dealt with before, where do we go from here? So do you feel like that was something you did very consciously? Is that something that you continue to do very consciously beyond the medical year?
Absolutely. I mean, some of it was unconscious. So for example, like sitting down with an OBGYN to say, you know, the sonographer, is that what they call the person who does the ultrasound thing? You know, she used the wrong pronoun for me. Here's why that was a problem. Here's what I want to be different, like that. I've just been having those kinds of corrective conversations, whether I'm like working with a group of white people and someone says something racist, I have a similar conversation. They were done a little bit unconsciously, but since then I've been like, what did I do that worked? And can I teach that to other trans people? But the calling ahead, self-advocating, asking allies to advocate on my behalf, all of that was very, very, very conscious, because I know it's so much harder on the other end. Once a provider has done or said something inappropriate, it's so much harder to correct them. And two, in the culture of medicine, it's very much, there is still quite a bit about right and wrong, who's right. And telling someone I don't like that language can feel like I'm saying you're wrong, right? So it's so much easier to ahead of time to just say, look, here's what I need from you. Can you do it? If not, who can? And it was all, yes, it was intentional, it was conscious. If I found anyone that I didn't feel could show up in the way that I needed, I found someone else. I just had to.
Thought, I mean, you mentioned Canada, which you clearly have a tie to, but we had traveled all over the world to all kinds of strange places with my kids, and we were going skiing in Canada, and we flew into Quebec, and we arrived, and the person at passport control said, we were just with my son, where is this child's mother? And I said, he doesn't have a mother, he has two fathers, we're his two parents, we're both here. And she said, every child has a mother. And I said, well, actually, he really doesn't have a mother. And it turned into a big discussion. And I was, of course, horrified and upset for myself, because I felt like it was an affront to our parenthood. But I was also horrified and upset that it was going on in front of my child. Unfortunately, I always travel with his birth certificate, and she finally sort of stepped down and said, well, okay, and into Canada we got. But I thought, wow, in Sri Lanka and Jordan and Brazil, we didn't have this problem. I feel we could very easily have had it coming through US Customs. I'm not being anti-Canadian here, I love Canada, but I just feel like even in the countries that seem to be the most evolved, and Canada in many ways has seemed more evolved on this stuff than the USA, even in the places that are the most evolved, you still encounter these sudden moments where your sense of dignity and selfhood are being challenged. And you do need resilience to get through them. And it's much more painful, all of that stuff, once you have kids. Once you have kids, there's that wish to protect them from the anger and hatred of the world. So one of the attendees has said, prior to now having written your own book, did you struggle with feeling ownership over your story as media outlets tried to sensationalize you and your family? If so, what helped anchor you?
I just want to see the word struggle with feeling ownership. Very early on in the process, I just decided really clearly I only wanted to work with outlets who were willing to not sensationalize, who are willing to tell the truth. And I happen to have a lot of experience in storytelling and persuasion and how do we tell complicated stories. about family and sexuality and gender in really accessible ways. How can we proactively address some of the most common questions, myths, stereotypes, etc.? And how can we use the media to do it? And so very early on, I realized, guess what? Those media outlets really wanted an interview with me. And it was very easy for me to say, sure, if you disable comments when you share it on social media, if you include that I'm working with a medical team, if you don't call me the first, anything, ever, never do that. And I was able to say really clearly, and I worked with my friend Nick Adams at GLAAD, who's the trans messaging director at GLAAD, to say, like, what are my talking points? Like, what are people coming in with that I can make CNN, Vice News, that I can say, if you don't cover these, if you don't include these things, I will not give you an interview. And every single one of them to a person was like, no problem, we'll do it. I don't know if we can do that. And then I'd be like, great, let me know when you know. And then I'll decide if I can give you an interview. Because they're like, well, I don't know if we can disable comments. Okay, well, let me know when you find out. And so that, for me, that's really how I anchored myself, is I just asserted control. And whenever people try to come to me to be like, oh, you won't believe what the Daily Mail is saying, I said, I will believe what they're saying, and I don't want to believe what they're saying. So do not show me that. And I had to tell people on social media over, do not send me the worst, most awful thing, some meme you found on, don't send that to me. And then be like, but don't worry, I said something to them. Don't send it to me at all. I don't need to see that. And so that's the other way. It's just like being really clear, like, why would I want to see that? I don't care about that. Keep it away. So that's how I tried to manage it.
And do you feel like your work for activist organizations, and we're going to have to wrap up in a minute,
You're fine.
Like work for activist organizations was very deeply informed by the need to figure out your own identity? Or do you feel like the clarity with which you eventually figured out your own identity gave you the power to be an activist? How did the two things play back and forth with each other?
It was about, very specifically, I chose to become an activist because I started to hate gay people very, very, very clearly. I was acting professionally and I was bartending in gay bars at night, and being exposed to that many people who were drunk and insecure and mean and petty. Nothing against gay people. Straight people are that way in bars too. Bars just bring out the worst in people. I felt my love and connection to and for the community start to curdle. And I went to a friend of mine. I said, you do something gay, right? How do I get in on that? And that was Jonathan Boland, who was a field staff for the National LGBTQ Task Force. And he said, sure, come and volunteer. And so it was not about necessarily who I was. It was all about, I wanted to fall back in love with the things that made me proud to be queer to begin with. And that's what activism did for me.
That is beautifully said. And I, very sadly, am now supposed to wrap things up and bring an end to what has been a fantastic and stimulating and inspiring and wonderful conversation. And I just want to emphasize again to all of you out there who have not yet had a chance to read this book, that you have a great joy ahead of you. And I want to emphasize to you, Tristan, as I was reading this book, thought, gee, if I had been able to read that book when I was trying to get ready to come out, just as gay, not in as complicated a way, perhaps, at least at that time, as coming out as trans, but when I was getting ready to come out, it would have given me so much hope. And you're going to do that for a lot of people. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew. It's a delight to be your friend and colleague in the movement. I appreciate you.
Great.
Well, Tristan and Andrew, it was so wonderful to host you both this evening. And thanks to everyone who joined in tonight. And please consider purchasing a copy of Tristan's book by visiting us at powells.com. And while there, be sure to check out, there it is. Be sure to check out our lineup of other upcoming virtual events. And we look forward to seeing one another at another event soon. So Tristan, Andrew, thanks again so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Good night, and good night, everyone.